Hi, Bill.
Hey, Bob. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you doing?
I'm hanging in there, thanks.
That's all a person can do these days.
That's for sure.
Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on streaming video and via audio podcast. You're Bill Kristol, probably well known to pretty much everyone who would be watching this or listening to it. How do you introduce yourself if somebody says, like, what do you do or who are you?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I help run a group called Defending Democracy Together. So I have and I have conversations with Bill Kristol, our own version of podcasts and video conversations every 2 weeks, not as frequent as yours and not as long running as yours. So I have my various enterprises. I was editor of the Weekly Standard for 2 decades, helped start that, was one of the founders of that magazine. And that was, I think, a good but late lamented enterprise. So I don't know.
Okay. So now there is a backstory to this conversation. And until we made contact just a few minutes ago, I wasn't sure whether you were aware of it. It turns out you weren't.
Right.
So let me repeat it for our audience. I had written some things that are critical of you, a couple of things that are critical of you. And somebody who once worked for you, I think at the Weekly Standard, somebody named Ethan, who is a follower of the podcast, contacted somebody associated with Blogging Heads TV, the platform on which this runs, and said, you deserve to have your day in court, respond to my criticisms. Now, in our conversation before this, conversation a few minutes ago, I learned that you, not only were you not aware of that story, you weren't aware of the criticisms, which is kind of awkward and, a little insulting maybe, but I'll get over it eventually.
That's why once I found out you've been critical, I figured I should, repay in kind by pretending not to even have noticed them. So I'm vaguely aware of them. I think Ethan Epstein's a wonderful guy though, and worked at the Weekly Standard for several years. And I think, and is now doing some other things, but he didn't tell me he was getting in touch with someone who associated with you. So.
Huh. Okay. So, why don't we just talk about, what I'll do then is, as we talk about you, your career, whatever, what you're doing now, I will try to subtly insinuate these criticisms, and see how you respond to them. I'm very glad to hear you have no advanced preparation. It does give me a little bit of an edge.
I'll pretend not to even understand as you subtly insinuate them, so then they'll just fly by.
Right. I mean, the truth is you've been in intensive preparation for days for this, of course, right. Feigning ignorance of the subject. So I would say now you are best, you're one of the people who has, become a big part of the resistance, the Trump resistance, which I guess persists until he finally concedes. And as we tape this on November 23rd, he hasn't. And maybe one of the more surprising members of the resistance to some, you were known as a neoconservative, certainly originally, and you had been very involved in Republican politics. You were known for encouraging John McCain to take Sarah Palin on as a running mate and so on. So it struck people as quite a switch. And at the same time, I'd say, on in some policies, you moved a little to the left of where you had been. Matt Iglesias of Vox at one point referred to you as woke Bill Kristol. I think that's going a little far, but he was joking. So you want to talk about that a little? That does lead to one of the things, one of my criticisms. But why don't you go ahead and?
Yeah, I'm not really big on the kind of self-analysis here. I would say generally, I was a McCain Republican, probably if you wanted shorthand, Reagan McCain. And I think a lot of the McCain Republicans were pretty anti-Trump, have been pretty anti-Trump, including John McCain himself, obviously. I was a hawk and am a hawk on foreign policy. And I would say a fair number of my fellow hawks also were anti-Trump, partly because our hawkishness was a kind of democracy promotion human rights sensitive. I don't know how to say it exactly, but kind of foreign policy, American principles and ideals, and whatever one thinks of that foreign policy, and there are plenty of things to debate about that. Trump is the other pole of that. But for me, I guess my opposition to Trump was not, the America First thing was offensive. A lot of his policies are very bad, but it was more, I guess, always about character and, just the total disregard for democratic norms and sort of respect for his fellow citizens and so forth. I had supported McCain and Romney cheerfully, and Bush after he beat McCain in 2000, and worked for the Reagan and first Bush administrations. I never had any problem with those presidents. In general, I had problems with them, but I thought they were reasonable people to be presidents. I also respected the Democratic presidents of my, adult lifetime. And I think I was occasionally pretty partisan in criticizing them, but in almost every case, I supported them. Not that I mattered much, but the Weekly Standard supported them. Shortly after the beginning of the Weekly Standard, Bob Kagan and I wrote the first piece we wrote together was a defense of President Clinton's intervention in Bosnia. It was like December 95, I guess. And I remember we had a whole bunch of subscription cancellations. I didn't subscribe to a conservative magazine to read editorials defending Bill Clinton. I suppose that was an early sign of the partisanship and tribalism that's become so dominant today. So I haven't done a whole lot of introspection as to why I ended up where I ended up. I think I ended up in the right place, honestly. I don't even think it's a very close call. I occasionally in the early 2015, 16, 17, I guess, I'm not totally without some self-doubt. So I would occasionally think, what if I'm wrong? Maybe I'm just wildly exaggerating how bad Trump is for the country and for our liberal democracy. And maybe some of people I've known a long time and people I worked with, allies, the way in Washington, you have a ton of friendly acquaintances, allies. They're not close friends, but they're, people you respect and you've, done things with over the years. And they were not where I was. And I, occasionally I think, what if am I just wrong? Am I getting the whole balance of things? Am I just, I don't like him personally. So it's that overwhelming prudential judgments about what's good for the country. But I was always reassured, and I think this is sincere. The people I have, if you'd asked me before this whole thing began, what 20 people that you've worked with in Washington, or Washington's too narrow, but in politics and ideological struggles and so forth, that you respect the most in terms of their basic character, their basic judgment. If I had given that list, I think a very high percentage of them were anti-Trump. Maybe not all quite the way I was, but certainly on this side of the dividing line in terms of is he acceptable? Is he someone one has to defend and justify and kind of pretend that it's not a terrible thing for the country? And that reassured me. The people I thought the best of, it wasn't 100%. There are people I thought very well of who went the other direction. And there, of course, NeverTrump, like any group, has people who are of maybe different motives or people I don't have 100% the highest view of. Though on the whole, it's a pretty good group, I've got to say. And I've met new people in it, incidentally, who I have very high opinion of, including a lot of younger people. So I'm reassured that I'm not crazy and I'm not just being self-indulgent, I don't think, and I'm not being, solipsistic or something like that by the allies I've got in this NeverTrump effort. And I'll say finally that actually it's one of the really encouraging thing and personally satisfying, I guess, things over these last 4 years, which has been not difficult at times. Not difficult in any fundamental way that, people really go through difficulties, but, just sort of worrisome and depressing for the country and stuff. I think the people I've sort of been in the fight with, I feel I really like and respect and admire the younger people, particularly so. And that's, reassuring, right? If you looked around and everyone who's with you, you thought, oh, God, do I really want to hang out with these people or be allied with these people going forward? But that's been somewhat reassuring to me. And I've tried to, and it's led to a lot of rethinking. So that's probably been healthy too.
Okay, so we begin on a note of agreement. We agree that opposing Trump is not a sign of being crazy. You can definitely do it without being crazy. So your status as a kind of a member of the resistance is part of a piece I wrote for Vox that was in some ways critical of several years ago now, And it actually, my reaction, it grew out of a reaction that was to a proposal that you did not make, but my reaction wound up involving you. Here's what I mean. So Ben Wittes of Lawfare had proposed, this is in the early days of Trump, that Trump was such a looming peril that everyone who opposes him should put aside all differences among them of policy and so on, and just not argue about that and just focus on Trump. Mike Tomasky seconded the motion and used you as an example. He said, for example, Bill Kristol and I, God knows we've had our disagreements, but I'm willing to put that all aside for now. And this bothered me because I definitely didn't want to put aside my disagreements with you or any number of other people. So I wrote this piece in Vox saying, you had been an influential supporter of the Iraq War. I continued to differ with you on foreign policy, would continue to say so, and so on. And that itself, I doubt you consider a tremendously unreasonable position if I want to continue to disagree with people I disagree with, right?
As long as I get to disagree with you too, yeah.
That's what we're here for. But then that leads to the next thing I said about you was to some extent, to repeat something other people had kind of said, but it's a cynical, somewhat cynical theory about your motivation in some of the evolving you've done, I guess. You've been very fluid on domestic policy. Your views have stayed pretty much the same on foreign policy, so far as I can tell. And so here's the snarky line from the piece that, of course, you're pretending you're not aware of, but in fact, we know you've been preparing for this for days secretly. So you can feign surprise after I read it. I'll
do that. Yeah.
I wrote, a cynic might go so far, and some cynics have, as to suggest that a belligerent militaristic foreign policy is the lodestar for Kristol and some other neoconservatives, and that they're willing to support whatever constellation of domestic policies it takes to sustain a coalition for this militarism. In this view, the current moment is for Kristol, and I should stop here now, that there are other neoconservatives or people who were at one point called neoconservatives who are now part of the resistance. I guess, I don't know, Max Boot, David Frum, I guess Jennifer Rubin, maybe has been called neoconservative. Anyway, with that as bracketed, let me continue. In this view, the current moment is for Kristol an opportunity to win favor from fervent liberal anti-Trumpers, favor that can be used later to sell another war. Sorry about that. That was a little harsh, maybe. Anyway, that's the leave aside any language there. I mean, for example, I'm sure you wouldn't call your policies belligerent per se, and so you might quibble with the wording, but this question of whether what explains your many changes on domestic policy and your very few changes on foreign policy is the desire to assemble a coalition, whether it's in the Republican Party and involve Sarah Palin as part of a ticket, or maybe as someday in a Democratic Party, or for the time being during the Trump years, I guess was just kind of in the twilight zone. But that would support your favored foreign policy. Do you deny this charge vigorously?
I don't even understand what the charge is. I mean, on the first point, I think you misrepresent to some degree, though I haven't looked at it in a long time, Ben's point or Tomasky's point. I mean, they were simply saying that on fundamental issues, the coalition is more important than the disputes among us. But I've been involved in plenty of disputes or polite disputes about plenty of policies over the last 3-4 years. I think you're wildly exaggerating this notion that the resistance has to submerge any and all disagreements. At the Bulwark, we published pieces on the different sides of all kinds of.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying Wittes proposed something. That's
I don't
all.
think he proposed nearly as much of a submerging of differences as you're saying.
That's on the record. I think it was pretty stark, but that's on the record.
I think coalition of democratic forces is a coalition. And maybe you interpret, maybe I haven't read Ben's thing in ages, but anyway, I think it's a reasonable thing to say at the time. And I think it's overly, whatever. I don't think he was telling people they couldn't continue to be pro-choice or pro-life, or for national, for a public option in Medicare or not, or for whatever, higher tax rates or lower tax rates or whatever, or for a more dovish or more hawkish foreign policy. And I've worked side by side with all kinds of people who disagree with me on foreign policy, because I thought the threat of Trump was much greater than my preferred little foreign policies, even when Trump seemed to be sort of on, closer to me than perhaps many people in the opposition to Trump, which he was on some of the issues, not consistently, but on some particular issues in particular parts of the world. So anyway, so I think, it wasn't the reason it wasn't some brilliant calculation of mine. It would be a pretty bizarre calculation to make. It's certainly that I could somehow join in opposition to Trump against my own party and all my allies and all the people with whom I built up relationships and credibility over the years, and sort of magically take this whole other group of people who have pretty strong views and, bring them over to my view just by bringing whatever few assets I had to the table to anti-Trump. So I don't think it's a reasonable, just as an analytical matter. It seems to be kind of it would be a silly calculation to make. And in fact, I have many friends with whom I was associated in sort of criticism of the Iran deal, let's say, or criticism of Obama's Middle East policy, including some of the criticism of Israel, some of Obama's criticism of Israel, criticism of other aspects of Obama's policies, who made the opposite. I think, in fact, if you were making policy calculations, you calculated, I'll put up with a lot of the nonsense from Trump, most of it's rhetorical, and we'll get some of the tougher policies we want in key parts of the world, pro-Israel community. I mean, I think, unfortunately, a fair number of them made that calculation. So I didn't. So now for me, Trump came first. You seem to be slightly obsessed with Sarah Palin. I will say, just not want to obsess about it either, but I will just say, as a matter of fact, I wrote a piece in the New York Times 10 days before McCain made a VP pick, urging him to pick Joe Lieberman, which was consistent with my hawkishness. So there you go. It does prove, yes, that I in many ways thought the foreign policy challenges were more important than some of the domestic policy differences. And I said, I don't care if he's pro-choice or whatever, or has democratic views on all kinds of issues. Climate change at the time was between the two parties. I think it's more important to have a strong foreign policy. That was ignored. I was told by all the pros, you couldn't pick Lieberman. I still think that was wrong, but whatever. So then I was okay with sort of, take a long ball pick on Palin, who I've met once and who was thought of moderately well at the time, but she turned out, of course, not to be up to it at all. And I said she wasn't up to it pretty quickly afterwards. And so, whatever, but I was wrong in hoping that I hoped, I'll just say one last thing about that. I mean, I hope that it was a way of co-opting what I did see to be a rising populism that could be co-opted in a sort of healthy way, in the way American politics often has, into one of the two major parties, in this case, obviously the Republican Party. I don't think that was a crazy idea. Palin in 2008 campaigned as a McCain Republican, obviously. She was not right-wing on immigration or on she was a traditional internationalist and so forth. She turned out not to be up to it personally, but I don't think it was this idiotic idea that maybe there was a way to co-opt that rising populist sentiment in a healthier way than it ended up manifesting itself, obviously, with Trump. So that was my calculation there. It turned out to be incorrect in that case. And
let me be clear about a couple of things. One is the idea here isn't just that Trump comes along and you make this calculation and some sharp move. It's meant, I think, as an explanation of a longer standing flexibility on domestic policy as opposed to foreign policy. And I'm not even sure it has to be at a level of conscious calculation so much. I think people. But
I accept that. That. Yeah. I mean, a lot of domestic policy, there are moments in foreign policy decisions are just more important than differences in domestic policy. And so I accept that the priority in some ways, not in every issue, but at certain times of foreign policy.
So Sarah Palin was one thing she was solid on foreign policy.
She wasn't nothing. She was nothing on foreign policy. It might increase the chances of McCain being elected as opposed to Obama. She wasn't going to be a problem as vice president. I didn't realize how silly and irresponsible she would end up being, but that was a mistake of mine. but it was entirely just to help McCain. That's all I was thinking about.
Okay. So, I don't know if we need to say anything else about that. Politicians do this all the time. They're willing to trim their sails on some things, not on others.
Isn't that sort of part of life? I mean, you prioritize.
In general, my view of human behavior is that it's often hard to distinguish between things that are done out of conscious calculation and just things that kind of happen. Foreign policy is kind of my big thing, too.
That's why you're obsessing about it now. So what are you objecting to? I mean, I told you that I think the foreign policy differences were more important than the domestic policy differences. There's no question here of, gee, I was being deceptive or I didn't understand what I was doing.
I guess I was more concerned about the consequences that you built a huge, by my standards, huge Twitter following. A number of other neoconservatives did, kind of via the resistance. And I just, it worried me in terms of thinking about future foreign policy decisions that liberals might make, that you kind of had this cloud, I guess, with liberals.
Fine. That's fine. You should then make the case for your foreign policy views. You should worry less about my Twitter following, more about the merits of, non-interventionism or whatever it is that you want to defend. So
I'd be happy to spend another hour talking about.
Yeah, you defend. I'll defend Iraq and you defend Syria. We'll have that conversation. I've had it many times, as you have too, and it's a perfectly legitimate debate.
Okay.
The fact is, I didn't spend my 4 years trying to seduce other people who were anti-Trump over to my foreign policy views. I was never. I was candid about my foreign policy views. They weren't central, I didn't think, in the last 4 years in terms of the opposition to Trump. It's much more important to preserve liberal democracy at home right now than to help defend it or promote it abroad. But I assume those debates will begin again. And I do think there's actually been some change too, post Obama and post Trump. I'm not sure that the divisions are quite as sharp as they seem to be in the first part of the 2 decades ago, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So, well, if you're game, then maybe down the road we could devote a conversation to arguing about that stuff.
Sure.
Okay, so I think the person who set this conversation in motion had in mind or had read a piece I wrote about you and Tom Cotton, and I think one thing he was saying was that you're not as close to Tom Cotton as you were once, but you were. I think you'd agree you were involved to some extent in the rise of Tom Cotton. You became good friends with him and supported him, and you and I think, well, not you personally, but I think, for example, the Emergency Committee for Israel, which I gather you played a big role in starting, helped finance his campaign when he ran for Senate after having served in the House. And well, first of all, I mean, I would assume that's a case where his foreign policy is important to you.
Yeah, I mean, it was at the time, and I'm very distressed by the way he's gone in the last 4 years, and I don't feel the same way towards him. And I've had this conversation with him. I mean, we just had fundamentally different understandings of Trump and how much he was a threat and how much one could sort of work with him. And I think Tom may have thought he was doing the right thing, but I can't, going forward, I don't feel the same way that I did certainly 5 years ago. Yeah.
Okay. But his foreign policy is not so much changes in his foreign policy that have you unsettled, I assume, as the symbiosis with Trump.
Yeah, the fundamental lack of judgment it shows to have been willing to accommodate and excuse so much of what Trump's done, which has spilled over a little bit, and for me too, to some rethinking of foreign policy, maybe a little too much confidence in that all hawks were sort of, everyone who was hawkish should be embraced quite as much as anyone else who was hawkish. Though I think I was always able to make some distinctions, but so maybe there's been a little rethinking there too. And the Trump years have been interesting because there I do think that you see a kind of bellicosity that's counterproductive in Trump's case at times. And which I don't think was generally the case with the kind of McCain, Lieberman, more traditional hawkishness, but whatever. Yeah. Anyway, yes. So I did know Tom pretty well, and I helped him a little. I don't think he needed a lot of help from Bill Kristol to get elected in Arkansas, frankly. But and I had hopes in a different era that there'd be a kind of younger generation of 9/11 veterans. I still have hopes about that, who would be kind of renew our politics in both the Democratic and Republican Party. The irony is I've turned out to be closer in the last 2 years. Closer. I don't see most of these people much in either case, especially not in the last 8-9 months. But I feel more sympathetic to some of the Democratic 9/11 generation, if I can call them that, the people who served either in the military or in other kind of national security or just public service kind of roles, than to Cotton. So but this will feed your great fears that, all these people, the Abigail Spanbergers and the Alyssa Slotkin and all the sort of somewhat hawkish 2018 House Democrats and are going to be not allowing the party to go in quite the foreign policy direction that you might want it to. That's not. I
actually don't know those names, but I will now start paying attention. Thank you for putting them on the radar.
They're just members of Congress.
Yeah,
Tony
okay.
Blinken, I guess they just announced the foreign policy team, so I'm actually. I know them slightly, of course, not very well, and mostly know them from debating against them in various think tanks and, on various issues over the last couple of decades. And, but I am pleased, actually, that Biden's foreign policy team, I think, is reasonably centrist and certainly committed to American leadership in the world and to the maintenance of the, the global, the liberal order and so forth, which that's good. But I don't agree with them on everything, obviously.
Yeah, I think you're more pleased than I am, but not that I'm against world order. Yeah, they seem to be, don't they? Isn't it funny? So one thing about Cotton, though, it seems to me it was pretty clear from the beginning that he's got a screw loose. Let me tell you something he did before you helped fund his Senate campaign. When he was in the House. And I would think this would have crossed your radar screen, but in any event, I would think if you knew him, pretty well, this kind of thing would come. So he offered an amendment to a House bill that would have punished with up to 20 years people who violate Iran sanctions. Fine, I guess, seems a little extreme, but these would by and large be Iranians. But it would also punish their relatives. And they asked him, what relatives? He said, this is a quote. Parents, children, aunts, uncles, nephews, nieces, grandparents, great-grandparents, grandkids, great-grandkids, he said, would be punished along with the person who actually committed the infraction. And he said, I sympathize with their plight if they are harmless, innocent civilians in Iran. That's a quote. But, he adds later, I doubt that is often the case. He doubts, I guess, that there are many innocent civilians in Iran. I don't see it's how you can support this person. and this is a person he was then.
I honestly have no memory of this, and I assume if I knew about it at the time, I thought it was a kind of stunt, maybe a silly stunt, but I assume this thing was never voted on or never became law or whatever. So, yeah. But one thing I have learned is one should forgive stunts like this less than I probably did in the past, because they lead to a certain kind of rhetoric and a certain kind of politics that Trump has exploited and others obviously around the world have exploited that is dangerous. I take that point. Okay.
So the I guess the final category of criticism that Ethan may have been referring to, and again, you're doing a great job of feigning surprise here. I gotta say, for somebody who's been, who probably in fact stole the briefing books that I was using, so you were founding co-editor of the Weekly Standard or something. You're one of the founders. You got, it was what, originally it was a Rupert Murdoch funding, and then the funding changed, but you were there from the beginning with Fred Barnes, my old colleague at the New Republic, and, well, who was the third editor initially? Was
John Podhoretz, and
okay.
David Brooks and Andy Ferguson. And
okay. So, so you were editor of that. You helped launch the Free Beacon. I think you were on the board of the nonprofit that started it. I think it now is on a for-profit footing. But anyway, you helped start it. I think the first editor, a long-time editor, was your son-in-law. And it seems to me that I have in the past criticized both of these publications for being a little too eager to stigmatize people on the basis of very scanty grounds. The case with the Weekly Standard, this is while you were editor-in-chief, do you remember the Ground Zero Mosque thing in New York? So this imam, I think, had good intentions. His name was Ralph. I had actually met him once. Wanted to start a Islamic Cultural Center / mosque near the site of the 9/11 attacks. I think he genuinely meant it as a gesture of, goodwill. But in any event, it encountered fierce opposition, including in an article. You didn't write this piece, but you were the editor-in-chief at the time. And one of the things they said in the piece was, by way of casting suspicion on this imam, they made the following point. Ralph's wife, had an uncle who was once the leader, the quote was a leader in the piece, was once a leader of a mosque. Okay, this is not the imam who's starting a cultural center, not his wife. It's her uncle. He once was a leader of this mosque. He no longer is, but now this mosque may not itself be radical, but it has a website that links to the website of an allegedly radical organization. That was the chain of guilt by association. And so let me just go ahead and give you the I think and this is actually leading to a larger point. It isn't just the governing ethos of these various publications you've had some connection
that's just
with.
Totally. I mean, look, I don't recall the piece, and I think we may have been on the wrong side of the debate. I wasn't that much involved, honestly, of the post 9/11 mosque. I assumed it was done with sort of bad intentions, and maybe I was just wrong. And a lot of people did, and it was debated. And conservatives actually split some on it. But it's just unfair to say that the Weekly Standard routinely denigrated opponents or in that way. It was a pretty, I think most people, including an awful lot of people who didn't agree with much in it, thought it was, tried to make arguments in serious ways. And it had a kind of, we were willing to make fun of people, and we weren't always as respectful. And we had wonderful authors who were good at being occasionally, being tough at times, but also, a little bit, I don't know what the right word is, puncturing people's pretensions and stuff. Anyway, I don't recall, obviously, the piece or that sentence or anything like that, but if it was inappropriate, I guess I apologize for it. But it's not a fair characterization of the Weekly Standard, honestly.
Oh, I didn't say that every piece was like this, but I mean, it was in the magazine,
Okay, fine.
And it's not just
it's childish. It's childish.
It's not just the bizarre tenuousness of the chain of association. It's the fact that the goal of the chain is to identify this guy as the other, a terrorist. He may be a terrorist sympathizer. It just seems to me that kind of thing, I mean, that is at some level the same xenophobic impulse that Trump uses on immigration and other things. So
we were consistently liberal on immigration when it was not popular to be so among conservatives. We didn't identify Muslims as the other. We supported intervention in Muslim lands to help liberate them, maybe you think foolishly. So the idea that we published Muslim authors, I mean, it's just a totally unfair criticism. Now, if you want to go through 50 issues a year, 48 pages an issue, and find one article that
I will tell you honestly.
Well, you clearly have gone through it, so good for you.
No, I will tell you honestly, this is one of the very few pieces I've read. The only in the Weekly Standard, with all due respect, I just didn't read the magazine. The only reason I read
maybe
this,
you shouldn't opine about what its general tenor.
No, look, let me just set the context. I was at the New Republic for several years when Mike Kinsley was editor. I'm telling you, a line like this would not have gotten through because that was the governing ethos.
Okay. Well, since you don't, okay. I would like Mike Kinsley. I respect the New Republic. I suspect I could find some unfair lines in New Republic pieces, but I didn't ever gone back to look for them and to obsess about them. But anyway, since you didn't read the Weekly Standard, maybe you should confine your Well, you say whatever you want. I don't care. But anyway.
Well, I'm giving you your chance to respond.
I'm proud of the Weekly Standard, and that wasn't, and generally, a lot of people, as I say, including people we disagreed with, respected it. And certainly the particular charge of othering or whatever you're now saying is...
Well, that's what this is.
Okay, so that one sentence, so maybe that one article may well have been a mistake.
Okay. But I think a more, in my view at least, a more common committer of this kind of thing is the Free Beacon, which you were never editor of, but you kind of
never involved with, actually. But anyway, I was on the board of the not-for-profit that for 9 months until it got handed over to others who ran it, but whatever.
Okay. I was under the impression you played a pretty big role in getting it started, but maybe not. Have you paid enough attention to see that it kind of does this kind of thing, trying to stigmatize people like a lot?
I mean, I haven't read it much in the last 3-4 years, it's been pro-Trump or at least anti-Trump, and I guess I just decided I don't need the aggravation. No, it was always on the edge of being kind of really poking at people and mocking them, probably a little more than I personally would have done, but it was also a bunch of young people who do that kind of thing. I wasn't aware that everyone is so, sensitive to these things, but whatever.
Of the things they do, I guess there's one that I'm sensitive to in particular. And again, it's not like I read the Free Beacon. If something comes to my attention, fine. The one, an example I remember is, you remember when Chuck Hagel was up for Secretary of Defense, some parts of the pro-Israel community were very much against it. The Free Beacon ran a piece. The headline was something like, Chuck Hagel said, State Department is controlled by Israel or something. And it turned out there was some blogger no one had heard of, had several years ago gone to a meeting that Chuck Hagel was at and quoted him or something. And that was the basis for the headline. It's stuff like that. I mean, I think in the case of the Free Beacon, honestly, if I made it a research project, I would not have any trouble coming up with things like this, often in this realm, stigmatizing critics of Israel. There's been a lot of that over the history of the Free Beacon, I think. And I can tell you why I have paid particular attention to that one thing, because I want to talk about that. But does this sound like
I opposed? I was publicly very critical of Hagel's, Obama, right. President Obama, for picking Chuck Hagel as Secretary of Defense. I thought it was a bad pick. I thought he had been more anti-Israel, or more critical of Israel, if you want to put it in a more neutral way, than someone I would like as Secretary of Defense. And he was a bad Secretary of Defense to me. I've since seen Chuck Hagel. We have we have pleasant chats in the green room. I think he's a decent person, but he wasn't a good Secretary of Defense, and I think he quickly left pretty quickly, and it wasn't really up to the job, which was the main point of the criticism that I was involved in, I think. But yeah, so I have no big. I mean, again, in retrospect, those 15 years, I don't know, from 2000, I suppose, to 2015, there are a lot of things I now look back at and think, boy, I wish I'd been less harsh. I wish I had been more modulated in my criticism of people I disagreed with. And that's probably the case with Hagel as well. I think I was right, though, to think that he was not a good choice for Secretary of Defense.
I don't think he was a stellar Secretary of Defense. And I don't really remember anything you yourself said. I remember at the time there was a lot of insinuation, and I would include the article I just described in that he was anti-Semitic, which I thought was unfair, and on the basis of what had actually happened. There was a thing in commentary that pretty much said it, I think. And and the reason this bothers me, well, I think in general you shouldn't try to stigmatize people when you argue. You should argue against their positions. But I'm someone who on foreign policy, I don't know if you want to describe it as on the left or what, but I've certainly been critical of Israel, and it is in some ways you have to be careful, precisely because there are people out there like Free Beacon who would love to insinuate bad things about you, insinuate that you're anti-Semitic, whatever. And you nodded your head. I noticed I was saying that. So do you think I'm actually diagnosing the situation correctly?
No, I think I guess you're subject to unfair attacks when you're critical of Israel, and you're subject to unfair attacks when you're Jewish and you're pro-Israel. And God knows there have been plenty of those. So,
well, that leads to what is maybe the most delicate.
I'm not complaining about it. That's a fact on both sides. It's a heated issue, and it's tied in with issues of religion and history that are obviously very that are fraught. You know?
No, that is the most interesting part of this to me. It seems you're unabashed about being a supporter of Israel. There are lots of supporters of Israel. I personally, this is just an asterisk, but I think the term pro-Israel is in some ways misleading because in my view, some of the people identified as pro-Israel are not actually doing things that in the long run are good for Israel, but that's just an ideological disagreement, I guess. In any event, you would be conventionally called pro-Israel. You helped start the Emergency Committee for Israel. You make no bones about it. And I mean, I'm wondering, do you see, for example, your opposition to the Iran nuclear deal as being in some way motivated by your support for Israel? I mean, already here we're getting into a question that's very delicate for me to ask for reasons we understand, but
I think we all said it. The many of us who were critics of the Iran deal, we thought it was bad for the region and bad for the prospects of freedom and possible regime change in Iran, which would be a good thing, especially if it were accomplished peacefully. Bad to give the Iranians all that money, bad to relieve the sanctions. But one reason it was bad is that, yes, it endangered the state of Israel. You had a nation that was seeking to build nuclear weapons that was explicitly committed to the destruction of the state of Israel. So, sure.
Okay. But, well, I guess in a way, the question is, what versions of asserting that you are, or what characterizations of the role that Israel plays in your foreign policy calculus do you take offense at, if that makes sense? If it doesn't, I don't really take offense at it. I don't know. I have to see things. I don't have general lists of things I take offense at ahead of time. And I think I've been pretty good at not being too offended too often when it wasn't pretty obvious that people were trying to be offensive. I've been critical of Israel in the last few, especially with respect to the Trump administration. I think it was a mistake for Netanyahu to identify the pro-Israel cause so much with being pro-Trump. I had arguments about that personally with the Israeli ambassador to Washington, whom I knew a little bit. I haven't seen in a couple of years, but I did see him a couple of times in the early years of the Trump administration. So I think that was unfortunate. And I probably have become a little more liberal. I don't know what the right word is, dovish, maybe not quite dovish, but non-hawkish, less dogmatically hawkish, maybe, on some of the Israel-related issues. I suppose, yes, I do. Of course, even in foreign policy, I like everyone else, I've rethought things as time has gone forward, and also circumstances have changed. And Israel today isn't where it was 15 or 20 years ago, let alone, obviously, 40 or 50 years ago. So, anyway. Okay. I mean, the reason I asked that question, what does offend you, is because you said it's a problem on both sides. I mean, you can be stigmatized for criticizing Israel. You can be stigmatized for by claims that you're motivated by support for Israel. I took you to be saying, and I was just wondering what constitutes stigmatization.
Well, I believe the usual attack from the is more dual loyalty and such things, which of course is not unknown in American politics and wasn't unknown in pretty major works, pretty major pseudo-scholarly works and 15 years ago, and by John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt and so forth. So,
Well, I don't think they use the term dual loyalty, but I guess, with there are all kinds of lobbies, including ethnic lobbies, right? I mean, and in most cases, you can describe them. And let me say before I say this, I understand why, for historical reasons, what we're talking about is a special case, is a particularly sensitive case. I don't mean to deny that, but you don't get into trouble for saying Polish American voters are the reason NATO was expanded, even if you're wildly off base in how much influence you attribute to them. It's like, or if you say that our Cuba policy is driven by the Cuban diaspora in Florida because Florida is a swing state or whatever. This, and these are facts. This is the way politics works. There's nothing.
I think you would get in trouble if you were debating someone who was making an intelligent argument for NATO expansion, and you were making an intelligent argument against NATO expansion, and that person said, "You know what? I've discovered one of your grandparents is Polish, or your, I don't know, in-laws are Polish or something, and that's why you're making this argument. It's not a legitimate." I tried to conduct this debate on the merits, and a lot of people who are much more dovish than I, if you want to use that term, on Israel, or critical of Israel, I think have tried to conduct this debate on the merits. I debated J Street at a liberal synagogue in New York. I remember this over a decade ago, and the audience must have been, 10-1 against me. So it's not like I'm not used to debating Israel, including with Jews who have pretty different views on what our policy towards Israel should be, as well as different views, I suppose, on Israel's own foreign policy. So anyway, I don't know if we're disagreeing at this point. Yes, it's perfectly legitimate to debate. Generally a bad idea to ascribe motivations to people, including to Cubans or to Poles or anyone else,
Well, yeah, kind of to their face, so to speak. I mean, in other words, it's one thing to do a political science analysis and say, if it weren't for the Polish American vote, XYZ wouldn't have happened. It's another thing to walk up to somebody who's Polish American and say, if you weren't a traitor, so that's true. So, what about, say, Ilhan Omar's, she said it in a particular way, but, it's all about the Benjamins. What she was saying, was AIPAC. Well, the true version of it, I think, is AIPAC. It's proud of its influence on American policy. One of its levers of influence, although maybe not its main one, is money, not so much in the sense of it giving money to politicians, but in the sense of facilitating bundling, I guess, or something. But were you among those who would say that's anti-Semitic when she said it's all about, I forget exactly the phrase, it's all about the Benjamins, it's AIPAC or something, in explaining some politicians' support for some policy?
Yeah, it's on the borderline, since, she's making a claim that, if she has evidence, she should give it, that people are doing it simply because of money, which incidentally is much less prominent than it used to be with all the other money sloshing around. I spent a lot of time taking grief, however, I would say, from pro-Israel, if that's the right word, or let's just say hawkish on Israel Trump defenders for now being in alliance, sort of, with Ilhan Omar, since I guess we both supported Joe Biden. So I think
that's a form of othering. That's a form of othering they're engaging in.
Why?
I'm kind of kidding, but I mean, for them to say, I've gone
to meetings and there are people there. We've sort of looked at each other and thought, gee, we were kind of on opposite sides of this. An awful lot of somewhat, not emotional, but, sort of intense debates over the last 20, 30 years. And here we are together. I think that's a good thing. I actually am a little surprised that people are so worried and alarmed that people are able to come together against what's clearly a really bad thing for the country and agree to disagree on some things and to disagree after we deal with this threat. Unfortunately, I don't think this threat just goes away. So I suspect there's a lot more to be done. But also, I do think my friend Tim Miller said this in an excellent piece this weekend at the Bulwark. It's also been sort of liberating in the sense I think, tried to rethink things in foreign policy as well as domestic policy, or more broadly, let's just say. And differences that seem much greater 15 or 25 years ago seem much less great to me today.
Okay. How bad do you think things are coming out of this? Let's assume that Trump's bid to claim a second term fails. The betting markets currently give it between 4 and 5% chances of success, in case you're wondering. It seems to me we're still in a very bad way. What's your assessment of the situation?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we can endlessly debate how much he's the cause and how much he's a symptom, and he's exposed things that were a problem and also made the problem worse. I think both of those are correct. But, we have one of the two major national parties now that clearly is not repudiated, I would say. It hasn't. If Trump is an ex-president, things could get better in the sense that he won't have the presidency. from which to demagogue, and demagogues tend to be less powerful, and the divisiveness and the rabble-rousing they're capable of is less effective when they're out of office, one assumes, and seem maybe to be a little bit defeated, and not a little bit, have been defeated and seem to be maybe kind of yesterday's story. But no, I think it's terrible. The Republican Party is not going to be, I'm afraid, at all a responsible party in the near future. And that's bad for the system because they could win another election. They did win a lot of elections this November. In fact, they increased the number of seats in the House. People, I think, still haven't quite come to grips with how bad that is, really. It would have been much better to have a bigger Republican defeat and a more thorough repudiation of Trump and Trumpism. The average Republican now thinks, I don't really talk to them anymore, but I mean, I gather, as long as just Trump fades away, we kind of have to manage him a little bit more, and then we'll manage him when he's in Mar-a-Lago. But it'll be easier and easier to kind of get, avoid the really embarrassing things that he's thrown us into. And then we can sort of have Trumpism with a human face, or, be sort of accommodate all the Trumpist elements and with the corporatist elements. And I don't know, are we confident the Republicans won't take the House in 2022 or won't win the presidency in 2024? I'm not that confident. So, and I think that would be pretty bad for the country. So and then there's the pandemic and everything else. So I'm not, I'm very relieved that Trump is not going to have a second term, but I'm not, I am short-term worried, not short, medium-term worried about the country.
Yeah, I mean, suppose a more skillful operator picked up the mantle, like a Josh Hawley.
Yeah.
Would that bother you as much? I mean, there are a lot of bad features of Trump that Hawley doesn't have, but...
I mean, yes. I mean, my instinct, yes. I can't really see myself supporting any of those people for president or even being quiet and accepting them. I mean, you'd have to see, maybe he would repudiate a bunch of things that he's toyed with, and you could tell yourself I don't agree with him on everything, but it's a sort of respectable version of a kind of populist, sort of nationalist conservatism. But I think, for me, the willingness to go along with, and not just go along with, but almost encourage such bad aspects of Trumpism, and now these last 2.5 weeks, with the attack on the elections, pretty hard. I can't see really, forgiving them. That's not my place to forgive, but I just can't see supporting them in the future.
And what do you think? You said that you don't talk much to Trump supporters. What do you think about just that divide? Leave aside who's leading the Trumpist movement, or whatever you want to call it. It's kind of out there. And I think one thing people don't really appreciate, I mean, maybe I've been listening too much to the Steve Bannon podcast, but which I don't necessarily recommend for anybody who wants to preserve their mental health. But I really do think that there are a pretty large number of people out there who are really convinced that the election was stolen, and that's not going to change. And it fits very readily into the pre-existing narrative that they are that there's a kind of a conspiracy of elites, and I don't think they're crazy to imagine that maybe elites have overlooked their interests. And that some policy revision could stand to take place there. But what do you think about just at the level of kind of tribal psychology, what the prospects are for recovery?
Okay, so I agree about obviously looking at some policy questions where people were too confident about globalization and so forth. But but on the tribalism side, look, I think that's not going to change very quickly. I mean, having a president hammer this home, it was building anyway. Having a president hammer at home for 4 years with Fox News, with social media and everything that then presumably makes either more possible than it used to, I suppose. That's itself an interesting, you've done a lot of thinking about that, but that's an interesting question. But I think there's some truth to that, let's just say. That's bad. I will say this, though. I have always tried to stress a little bit in the endless conversations we've all had about Trumpism, the tribalism, polarization. A lot of that's bad, but it's a huge difference between having 20% of the country. It's not good to have 20% of the country believing in conspiracies, deeply embittered and alienated from large, major institutions, major parts of our political system, major, other parts of the other major institutions in the country. Whatever mistakes those institutions have made, it's just not a healthy situation if they're just not just critical, but really, believe in all kinds of conspiracies. But that has happened a lot in history, obviously, in American history too. And I think that's that can fade away. It can be managed. It can just, it could be the John Birch Society. It could be McCarthyism in the early 50s. And, without the oxygen of a president amplifying and legitimating all those beliefs, I do think there would have been reason to be hopeful. I guess, but I'll finish the point and come back. I mean, for me, therefore, the complicity of conservative elites has been under kind of reported as opposed to the base. Everyone's obsessed with the base, and the base has its own crazy views, and Trump says something, and then the base decides it's right, and suddenly 3/4 of the people allegedly believe that the election was stolen or whatever. But none of this would have happened, or this would have happened much less, it would be in much less bad shape, is that the right way to say it? Much better shape, if the conservative elites hadn't gone along and more than gone along, really defended Trump, with both Republican elected official elites and conservative intellectual elites, Wall Street Journal editorial page, National Review, many others. Not everyone at both those places, but a lot of them. I think and business elites and the donors. I think that's been extremely important. I just think just empirically, analytically, the power of a movement of that kind that resonates in all kinds of pockets of the country, but doesn't have the kind of support that they get from these elites is much less than the current situation we have. Or what I was going to say earlier is the way to do the thought experiment perhaps is, what if Trump got the nomination? It was sort of flukish. Bush was a weak candidate. He got 35-40% of the vote. Fine. There was this populist stuff that had been ignored. He appealed to people's resentments and bigotries. Terrorism hit at a time that it really helped him, Muslim ban and so forth. He gets the nomination. That could happen. He won the election, kind of a fluke, inside straight. I guess that can happen. Doesn't prove the country is in horrible shape if a guy who shouldn't be president wins an election by 77,000 votes. But here's the thought experiment. What if Republicans on the Hill had stood up to him from the beginning? It just said, look, you're president. Absolutely. You do what a president should do. But we're going to be willing to oppose you on a lot of things and call you out on a lot of things. What if the donor class and the business class had been willing to stand up to him and say, I'm sorry, we just can't support that. And we're not going to. What if there had been primary challenges, well-funded ones against him people said, OK, you won fair and square. You governed for a term, but no second term. And I spent a lot of time, totally failed in trying to get Republicans to support rule of law efforts on the Hill, to support a primary challenge against Trump. And for me, that was really the big story of the last 4 years. Trump is a big story, obviously, but the other big story is the total capitulation, and more than capitulation, enabling of Trump by Republican and conservative elites, which made him so much stronger than he would otherwise have been. So you can write a narrative of a kind of not very disciplined, fluky, demagogue who becomes president and is kind of ineffectual and does a few things and basically, and this is what a lot of people who voted for him in 2016 expected, right? The McConnell and Ryan will keep him in check, and the grown-ups in the administration will keep him in check. Well, they
did get their tax cut.
Yeah, but and that's what it turned out. I mean, it turned out in that respect that the caricature, what I thought was a bit of a cartoonish caricature of Republican elites, turned out to be correct. They didn't care about anything except the tax cut. A few others cared about the courts. A lot of them just cared about staying in power, I guess. And then a lot of them had a really cartoonish view of the Democrats and how terrifying they were. And for me, the last year has radicalized me a little bit, I got to say, in the sense that, and it was all Bernie Sanders and stuff, Elizabeth Warren, terrible, horrible. Bill, even you can't support that. And I actually would have supported them against Trump, but it would have been harder. And then I got involved a little bit in the Democratic primaries, trying to get Republicans and independents to vote where that's legal in the Democratic primaries and vote for Biden. Well, vote for a moderate candidate. And then Biden wins the nominations. Then I figured, okay, Biden's the nominee. Can we just all agree that 4 years of Biden, we can live with that? It's not going to be the end of the world. Get rid of Trump. You guys could all work on rebuilding the Republican Party and the conservative movement. I'm sort of so alienated from them by now that I'm just personally probably not going to be part of that. But I wish you well. Someone should do it, But no, Biden gets the nomination, and they're still all in for Trump, and Biden's just going to be taking orders from the aforementioned Ilhan Omar and stuff. It's truly nuts. And then the election happens and he loses. And so can we agree now that maybe he should have a peaceful transfer of power? Well, Bill, you don't know. Well, there's a lot more fraud than you realize, It's like, God. So the corruption and the rot was much deeper than I realized, I think.
Yeah. In terms of how few profiles in courage there are, I guess the only thing I'd say in their defense is that there aren't many of those in the world generally. And I count myself. I don't recall. Most of the times I've done something that was really bad for my career, it's been almost by mistake. If it has seemed courageous, it's just because, I was in such a bad mood that I said something I shouldn't have said or something. Just people do not very often resign from anything on principle if they don't have another job lined up. It's hard. And I think with Trump, they encountered this new force they hadn't quite encountered. This guy's got this huge Twitter following. He's willing to use it. He's a bully. And I also think they genuinely don't know, how bad, what is the long-term damage of having 3 bad days on Twitter. They didn't really want to do the experiment. It seemed pretty bad. Who knows where the voters would have been 9 months later. But, so I think they were beset by new scary forces and showed no more courage than the average person and maybe a little less. And maybe the depressing thing is that that's all it takes.
But you're a student of human nature and psychology. I think that's right. Very much correct about 2016 and 2017 and maybe 2018. What I guess I am struck by is by 2020, was it still, I guess they just, at that point, it seemed to me to change. It was not so much of, we're going to hope it works out better than it might look, and that would without me having to do much. And that wasn't a crazy view, the first couple of years. Jim Mattis is there and whatever, and it's not going to be too bad. I think by 2020, that was kind of becoming a sort of crazy view. But at that point, it switched to a different psychological mechanism, which was they were so deep in, that they felt they couldn't get out, I think, almost. It was too hard to reverse themselves. So it went from wishful thinking to, I don't know what the other term would be, rationalization of a certain kind. Yeah. I'm sure that's been studied a lot by psychologists, but the kind of, a little bit of a frog in the water thing too.
Maybe cognitive dissonance or something.
The rationalization, I say this sort of sometimes when there were still speeches, when I was giving speeches, I would often say, when I'm old enough, when I grew up, everyone was interested in studying totalitarianism, obviously, and how it happened and how intelligent people became defenders of Stalin or of Hitler. And people wrote books called, The True Believer. I think that was Eric Hoffer and Hannah Arendt. There was a huge literature, quite a lot of it, quite intelligent, interesting about this. And I read some of it. I thought it was interesting. I sort of kind of got it, I guess. The seduction of a kind of extremism and ideological totalitarianism, which then led to a kind of real totalitarianism or justified it. But it's the rationalization that I didn't get. The sort of the degree to which intelligent people who were living their lives kind of normally and weren't at the rallies screaming and yelling, but they still wanted to believe, they talked themselves into believing that this was okay and that the NeverTrump people were kind of hysterical. And that really, I don't know, I just hadn't seen that. I guess I didn't feel like I'd seen that as much or had as much experience thinking about that.
I guess my own view is we all do a little more of that than we realize or admit to. I thought I was kind of a Russiagate agnostic, more than a skeptic, just an agnostic. I hadn't seen the smoking gun. I thought it could show up, but I did see a lot of people seizing on things they were convinced was a smoking gun, which wasn't. And that is a little increment of conspiracy theory thinking that, if you add up a bunch of increments, you're saying that Venezuelans mass-produced voting machines that have subverted an American election, or whatever that theory is. So I think there's more work to be done on the resistance side as we try to move beyond this than maybe some people in the resistance.
No, that's a good point. That's fair enough. Look, the resistance is over. Now Biden's going to be president, and a lot will depend, I think, on whether Biden's a reasonably successful president or not for the country. I mean, I do think it would be very dangerous. Not that we could do much about it, probably, because the world is the world, but Biden will do what he does. But if Biden, it would be help if Biden is, if there's not if the pandemic rollout isn't, if the vaccine isn't rolled out well, if the economy doesn't pick up some, if we can avoid foreign policy crises, I mean, that would be healthy for the country, I would say. It'd be very healthy for the country if the first year of the Biden administration is viewed as reasonably successful. But given the way things are in the world, you can't really count on that, obviously. So.
No.
But to get to your foreign policy, I would be happy. I would, therefore, bracket a lot of things I would theoretically like to see in foreign policy. If someone told me, well, you can't, that's too risky to do, it'll be too divisive, it's too both risky in terms of the world, but also difficult domestically, I would say get the big stuff right now, get the pandemic right, get the economy going. I'm willing to bracket all my favorite foreign policy ideas for a year or two, certainly, because I do think it's important that Biden, you can't ask him to do everything you'd like him to do all at once.
And I don't suppose I could tell you on the idea that one stabilizing thing would be restoring the Iran nuclear deal without making a bunch of additional demands of Iran by just returning to the status quo ante?
I mean, I'm open to a version of that. I think literally restoring the deal probably just doesn't work for various reasons. But I mean, I'm open to the notion. I am not for super hawkish policy against Iran in the first year or two of the Biden administration. I'm not for a super dovish policy necessarily. I just think maybe, the status quo is not so terrible, is it? I don't know.
Well, actually, I think it is. I mean, I think Iran's under a lot of economic pressure. Iranians are suffering. And I think, there are people hoping for regime collapse. In my experience, be careful what you wish for. So I think the continuation of the sanctions and the isolation of Iran is a bad thing. But I just realized we said we might talk about foreign policy at some future day. So maybe I should give you the last word on that. Anything you want to say, except that I'm wrong and you're right?
No, but look, I think that's a reasonable. I mean, that's a reasonable debate to have, and I'm not dogmatic or even terribly worked up, to be honest, about exactly what version of combination. No one's for totally release. I don't think relaxing all sanctions, and no one's for the most hawkish policy right now. So it is. I mean, I don't quite know where. I honestly just don't even know what a reasonable central, John Kerry-esque policy on Iran would be right now. But I'm generally would be, as I say, I think a caution in foreign policy wouldn't be crazy for the first year or so in restoring making sure the alliances are strong. And but I don't know, I'm worried. I mean, even on things, I don't know where you were on trade and stuff, a bit TPP. I mean, that was just crazy. We gave up what was geostrategically good, I think, deal. I don't know much about the economics of it, but it certainly wasn't harmful economically. And now we've got China, just cutting deals with the Asian nations because the U.S. just stepped away. That can't be good for the future of global stability. So,
well, my generic view on trade deals is that and has been for a long time, I mean, for decades, but that, not put exactly this way, but is that if we want the people that Steve Bannon lovingly refers to as the deplorables to buy into robust economic engagement, we need to start putting truly meaningful labor accords into trade agreements. I don't think TPP had much of that as it was, but I'm pro engagement for sure, and I don't want to see a new Cold War with China or an economic decoupling or anything. There we may differ because
no, I'm sort of in between, I'd say, but yeah. So it's
okay. So is there anything else you want to? It's your turn to complain about anything I've said that was unfair, or
I have to maintain my pretense of equanimity and of ignoring all these unfair things that are said about me. So it was a good stimulating discussion, different actually from a lot of the ones I've had, which were just people patting each other on the back for being anti-Trump. So I thank you for that. Okay.
And it sounds as if you are open to the possibility of at some point in the future having an argument about foreign policy.
Yeah, let's do that.
In which we both refrain from ad hominem attacks.
That sounds good.
Okay. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks.